Gael never thought twice about his morning toast. At 67, it had been his quiet comfort: 2 slices of rye bread, a bit of butter, maybe some strawberry jam, eaten while the sun spilled softly through the kitchen window. It was a ritual, really, a piece of his routine that brought him calm before the noise of the day. His wife Clara would sip tea beside him. They didn't speak much in the mornings, but they didn't have to. The routine was their unspoken rhythm. But about 6 months ago, Gael started to feel off. Not sick exactly, just off. He would wake up groggy, his knees more swollen than usual, and by early afternoon, his brain would feel like it was trapped in fog. The kind where you forget the name of the neighbor you've greeted for 20 years, where you walk into the kitchen and can't remember why. At first, he blamed age, then maybe lack of sleep, then stress. But nothing he tried, more sleep, more walking, even meditation, seemed to clear the weight from his limbs or the haze from his mind. It wasn't until his annual physical that the dots began to connect. His blood sugar had crept higher, borderline pre-diabetic. Inflammation markers were elevated. His doctor, a gentle woman named Dr. Tran, leaned forward and asked him about his diet. "Nothing strange," he said. "Toast in the morning, sandwiches for lunch, some pasta, maybe a cookie here and there." But when she looked at his food journal, her brow furrowed. "Gael, it's not the amount," she said. "It's the bread." At first, he didn't understand. Bread, the same food he'd been eating since childhood? The same bread that nourished him through long workdays and early fatherhood? But as she explained the science, the hidden sugars, the processed flours, the gut-disrupting additives, Gael's silence deepened. How could something so simple, so familiar, have such a dark side? He left the clinic with more questions than answers, but he didn't dismiss them. Not this time. He started reading, watching, asking. And what he found startled him. The breads he trusted most, his rye, his multigrain, even the occasional white slice, were no longer made the way his mother baked them. They were shadows, chemically fluffed, artificially sweetened, rushed through machines that stripped them of every nutrient his aging body needed to stay strong. So Gael made a choice, a quiet one, but a real one. He cleared the pantry, sought out slow-fermented sourdough, learned what sprouted really meant. He found a small bakery in town where the bread felt heavy in the hand and sour to the tongue, and for the first time in months, his stomach didn't swell after eating. His joints eased, his mind sharpened. Slowly, quietly, the fog began to lift. This video isn't about diets or fads. It's about the small habits we trust too much and how sometimes they betray us. Gael's story isn't rare. It's happening in kitchens across the country, one innocent sandwich at a time. But it doesn't have to stay that way. If you've ever felt like something's just off in your body, your memory, your energy, you're not alone. And sometimes the answer isn't more pills or more tests. Sometimes it's in the very slice of bread on your plate. Let me show you what Gael learned, what you deserve to know too. It was a Tuesday, and the sun had just begun to paint streaks of gold on Gael's living room wall. Clara was humming in the kitchen, preparing tea the way she always did. 2 cups, one with a splash of oat milk for her, and one plain for him. Gael sat quietly at the table, eyes on his plate. 2 slices of dark rye toast, still warm, steam curling upward like a ritual offering. But that morning, something felt strange, not painful. Just off, as though the world around him was moving faster than his mind could catch. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the butter knife. He noticed how the edge scraped the toast louder than usual. How even the simple task of spreading jam felt like pushing through fog. There was a weight behind his eyes, not like fatigue from poor sleep, but something duller, more stubborn. Clara noticed, of course. She always did. "You all right?" she asked softly, standing behind him with a hand resting on his shoulder. He gave a nod, tried a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. It wasn't the first time he'd felt this way. Over the past few months, mornings had grown heavier. He chalked it up to age, the inevitable slope of life past 60. But that day, something tugged at him, like a thread he couldn't ignore anymore. After breakfast, instead of sitting down to his crossword, Gael pulled out a notepad and started jotting things down. Times he felt foggy, foods he had eaten, moments when his body seemed to betray him. By the end of the week, a pattern had begun to emerge. It wasn't the full meals, it was what he started his day with. Always bread, always toast. rye, whole wheat, or sometimes multigrain, the kind marketed as heart healthy. He wanted it to be coincidence. He even told Clara, half-jokingly, "Imagine if toast's the villain in my story." But in truth, he didn't feel like laughing. A few days later, he brought it up during his routine checkup. His doctor, Dr. Tran, leaned in with interest. "Tell me more about what you've been eating," she said. Gael described his mornings, the bread, the jams, the occasional sandwich at lunch. She didn't interrupt, just listened. And when he finished, she reached into her drawer, pulled out a printed report, and placed it in front of him. It was a study published just months earlier, 2024, American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. The headline caught his breath: "Daily consumption of refined and commercial rye breads linked to increased cognitive decline in adults over 60. Gael read it once, then again. His fingers gripped the edge of the paper. It wasn't just in his head. Something familiar, something he trusted, bread, might have been quietly working against him. Dr. Tran explained it gently. "It's not that bread is bad," she said. "It's that today's bread isn't the bread we grew up on. It's faster, cheaper, modified to be shelf-stable and sweet, and unfortunately, your body knows the difference." She mentioned inflammation, insulin spikes, even how certain bread chemicals, like caramel coloring and emulsifiers, had been linked to gut imbalance and brain fog in seniors. Gael felt a strange mix of betrayal and relief. Betrayal that something so simple, so comforting, might have been quietly draining him for years. Relief that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. He left the clinic that day with more than prescriptions. He left with questions, not the anxious kind, but curious ones. What if food could be part of the solution, not just the problem? What if bread, or at least better bread, could help him feel clear again? That night, he sat across from Clara and told her everything, not in a worried way, but in the way people do when they're standing at the beginning of a turning point. "I think I want to figure out what's really going on," he said, "starting with what I've been putting on my plate." And Clara, who had seen the dullness in his eyes and the heaviness in his steps, simply nodded. "Then let's start with the bread." The next morning, Gael opened the bread drawer like a man looking into a box of old secrets. Inside were 3 loaves, his usual rye, a multigrain Clara had picked up last week, and a half-used loaf of soft whole wheat they used for Clara's toast, and the occasional grilled cheese. They all looked familiar, safe, like nothing more than flour, water, and memories. But now, Gael saw them differently, not as food, but as quiet routines layered in blind trust. He turned over the multigrain loaf first. The front label boasted 10 grains and heart-healthy fiber. But the ingredient list told a different story. Enriched wheat flour came first, followed by a string of additives he couldn't pronounce and a caramel color note buried near the bottom. He squinted at the rye, the same thing, only a small percentage of actual rye flour, with the rest bulked out by refined wheat and glucose syrup. Gael let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. These weren't the breads he remembered from his childhood. He brought them all to the kitchen table. When Clara came in, she paused. "Doing a little inventory?" she teased, but then she saw the look on his face. He explained the labels, pointed out the ingredients. She leaned in closer, her brow furrowing with every strange-sounding additive. "How did we not notice this?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Later that day, Gael drove to the supermarket, not to shop, but to investigate. He walked slowly down the bread aisle, scanning loaves with new eyes. Whole wheat didn't mean what he thought. Multigrain was a marketing sleight of hand. Even loaves labeled keto or sugar-free were packed with emulsifiers, gums, and starches that made the dough soft and the shelf life long, but robbed the bread of anything his body could actually use. He saw one labeled 100% real rye that had less than 10% rye flour. The rest was white flour dyed dark. That evening, sitting at the table with a notebook open, Gael made a quiet promise to himself. Not a diet, not a restriction, just a shift. "From now on," he wrote, "I'll know what's in my food before I trust it." Not out of fear, but because he was finally starting to feel that his body had been speaking to him all along, and he just hadn't known how to listen. It was then that Clara mentioned something she'd read years ago about sprouted grain bread. "I remember reading it was easier to digest," she said, handing him her tablet. Gael tapped and scrolled. The studies surprised him. When grains are allowed to sprout before baking, the process activates enzymes that break down anti-nutrients like phytic acid, making minerals easier to absorb. One study showed seniors had 34% better B12 absorption after just weeks of eating sprouted bread. It wasn't just hype, it was real. It was science, and it made sense. He found a local organic store that carried sprouted grain loaves, so they went together the next morning. The bread was dense and oddly shaped, not as pretty as the supermarket ones, but the ingredients were simple, recognizable. Flour made from sprouted wheat berries, no sugars, no conditioners, just seeds, grains, and salt. Gael smiled as he picked one up. "This feels more like food than product," he said. They toasted it lightly that afternoon and added a thin spread of avocado with sea salt. The flavor was earthy, nutty, unfamiliar, but somehow honest. Gael's stomach didn't bloat. He didn't feel foggy. In fact, a strange lightness settled into him by evening. Not a cure, not a miracle, but the beginning of something softer, gentler. That night, Clara looked over at him while they washed dishes. "You seem clearer today," she said. He nodded. "I don't know what it is yet, but I think I just gave my body a little less noise." He wasn't chasing some health trend. He was following a thread that had begun unraveling the quiet harms of routine and stitching in something better. A few weeks passed, and Gael began to notice something unexpected, not just in his body, but in his mood. The sharp edges of irritability that had crept into his mornings were softening. He found himself humming without realizing it. His joints still ached now and then, but the heaviness in his belly had lifted. It wasn't dramatic, just subtle shifts. He could bend to tie his shoes without wincing. His walks with Clara were easier. He didn't need to pause halfway up the stairs anymore. Still, he was curious. "Why do I feel so light?" he asked Dr. Tran during a follow-up visit. She smiled and sat forward. "Gael, most people think digestion is only about the stomach, but it's not. It's your gut microbiome, your internal garden, and bread, depending on the kind, can either feed the weeds or nourish the roots." He raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me my bread was hurting my gut bugs?" She nodded. "Most commercial bread contains ingredients that damage the gut lining, emulsifiers, conditioners, preservatives, especially in something like commercial rye, which many seniors think is healthy." Gael thought of the fake rye he'd eaten for years, that dark loaf with the perfect shape and soft texture. He remembered how bloated he'd feel after 2 slices and how he used to joke that it just meant he was full. But now he realized that fullness was inflammation. Dr. Tran continued, explaining how modern rye was often little more than white flour mixed with caramel color and artificial flavors. "And the kicker," she said, "is that real rye contains powerful compounds called alkyl resorcinols. They help protect your gut and fight inflammation. But commercial versions, they strip all that out and leave chemicals behind." Gael felt a quiet pang of regret, not guilt, just a realization that he'd been feeding his body shadows instead of substance. Back home, he opened the cupboard where his old rye used to sit, empty now, replaced with a small batch sourdough he'd found from a European bakery in town, the kind that was baked for 24 hours using wild yeast and whole rye flour. It was dense, smelled faintly sour, and tore rather than sliced. But Clara had taken to it too. She called it real bread, and they both found themselves reaching for it without thinking. That evening, over tea, Gael opened his laptop and dug deeper. He found a study from the University of Michigan's Age-Related Disease Prevention Center showing that older adults who ate fake rye had 156% more advanced glycation end products in their bloodstream. The acronym AGES was bitterly ironic. These compounds aged your cells faster, especially when paired with inflammation. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. "No wonder I felt older than I was," he murmured. "I wasn't aging, I was being aged by what I was eating." Clara came to sit beside him. "You look upset," she said. Gael shook his head. "Not upset, just amazed. I thought memory loss and fog and digestion issues were just part of the deal. But now I'm not so sure." He closed the laptop gently. "Maybe we're not supposed to feel this broken after 60. He poured them both another cup of tea and added a thin slice of the sourdough, toasted and topped with olive oil and cracked pepper. It felt nourishing in a way he couldn't explain, like he was feeding something deep inside, something that had been quiet for years. As they ate, Gael looked at Clara and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How something so small, a slice of bread, can hold so much power over how we live, think, and feel, she smiled. And how lucky we are to notice it now, not later. He nodded, grateful, not for the answers, he didn't have all of those yet, but for the questions and the fact that he was finally asking them. It was a Sunday afternoon when it happened. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just a quiet moment that felt like a warning. Gael had been out running errands, groceries, a stop by the hardware store, and then he'd picked up a sandwich from the small deli downtown. He hadn't eaten there in a while, but nostalgia pulled him in. He ordered the usual turkey on white bread with lettuce, tomato, and a swipe of mayo. Simple, familiar. He sat alone on a bench outside the shop, unwrapped the sandwich, and took the first bite. It was soft, too soft, almost mushy. Still, he finished half of it before noticing how fast his pulse was thudding in his ears. His hands felt clammy. A strange heaviness pressed against his chest. Not pain, just pressure. He paused, set the sandwich down, and sat still, breathing. Something wasn't right. Back home, he told Clara what happened. I didn't panic, he said, but I felt slowed down, like my body was lagging behind itself. She watched him carefully, one hand on his wrist, feeling his pulse. It wasn't racing anymore, but he looked pale. You haven't had white bread in weeks, she said gently. The next morning, he called Dr. Tran. She listened carefully, then asked him to come in. Blood pressure, heart rate, blood sugar, all slightly elevated. Nothing alarming, but enough to raise questions. After a long pause, she said, I think your body just reminded you what you've left behind. She pulled up a study Gael hadn't seen before, from the Cleveland Clinic, 2024. Over 3,000 seniors, tracked for 5 years. Those who ate white sandwich bread daily had biologically aged 2.3 years faster than their counterparts. Their telomeres, those protective caps on DNA, were shortened by nearly 20%, more than normal aging could explain. Dr. Tran looked at him gently. This isn't about one sandwich, Gael. It's about how our bodies respond to what they've been freed from. Gael sat quietly. That sandwich had been a kind of ghost, a leftover piece of his old life. The taste hadn't even satisfied him, not really. He remembered how his mouth felt dry afterward, how the bread stuck to his teeth. I think it scared me, he said, not because of a heart attack, but because of what it represented, a return to sleepwalking through his choices. That night, he stood in front of the mirror, shirt off, brushing his teeth. He looked at his face, creased, weathered, and wondered how much of it was time and how much was habit. Clara walked by and kissed his shoulder. You're looking brighter lately, she said. He smiled. Except when I eat the bread of my past. They laughed, but there was truth in it. The next morning, Gael wrote a quiet note in his journal. White bread ages me, in body, in mind, in spirit. I don't want that kind of softness anymore. He went back to his sprouted loaf. Toasted, dense, flavorful. It required chewing. It had texture. It had truth. He began experimenting. Mashed avocado with lemon, almond butter with cinnamon, hummus with cracked pepper and sprouts. He wasn't cutting carbs. He was reclaiming them, on his own terms. The transformation wasn't about bread anymore. It was about noticing, about choosing with eyes open. Every bite became a conversation with his body, and slowly that conversation began to change. From confusion to trust, from symptoms to signals. One evening, Clara made a comment while they watched the sunset. I think you're walking taller lately. He looked at her, puzzled. Taller? She nodded, like something lifted off you. Maybe it had. Maybe it was just bread. Or maybe it was something deeper, the weight of unexamined routines finally being set down. It was late October when Gael forgot Clara's birthday. Not completely. He remembered the week, the season, the general feeling that something important was coming. But when the morning arrived, he didn't say a word. He made his tea, buttered his toast, and sat at the table like it was any other day. Clara didn't say anything either. She just placed her cup down a little more gently than usual, folded her hands in her lap, and looked out the window. It wasn't until Gael stepped outside to sweep the patio that it hit him. A flicker in the brain, a memory surfacing too late. He dropped the broom, ran back inside. Clara, he said out of breath. Oh no, I forgot. She turned slowly, smiled faintly. I know, she said. And it's okay. I just hoped you'd remember without the calendar. He He sat down beside her, shoulders low, heart bruised. "It scares me," he whispered, "when my mind feels like it's slipping out from under me." She reached for his hand. "It's been happening less lately," she said. "But today, maybe something triggered it." That night, he went through his food journal. He had been diligent about writing down what he ate, how he felt afterward. But 2 days before Clara's birthday, he'd run out of the good bread, the sprouted, the sourdough, the dense slices that took effort. In a moment of convenience, he'd grabbed what was on sale. It was labeled whole wheat, but it was soft, sweet, and strangely addictive. He'd eaten it for breakfast and lunch, even toasted some as a snack. It hadn't seemed harmful, but after months of better choices, his body and brain had clearly noticed the shift. The next morning, Gael walked into Dr. Tran's office carrying the wrapper from that bread. He laid it on her desk like a confession. She scanned it quickly, then sighed. "It says whole wheat, but it's made mostly of enriched flour. That means the bran and germ, where all the fiber and nutrients live, have been stripped away." She paused, then added softly, "There's a reason why people feel sharper with real whole grains. You're not imagining it." She pulled up a 2024 study from Harvard Medical School. It followed over 10,000 seniors for a decade. The results were stunning. Those who ate true 100% whole grain bread lived 3.7 years longer on average. But that wasn't what caught Gail's attention. It was this line. Participants had 35% lower risk of Alzheimer's and a 52% reduction in memory-related complaints. He sat back in his chair, jaw slack. "It's in the bread?" he asked. "In the grain?" Dr. Tran nodded. "In the integrity of it, not just what it's made from, but how little it's been messed with." Back home, Gael returned to the bakery. He asked to speak to the baker herself. A woman in her 70s came out, white apron dusted in flour. She handed him a loaf that weighed like a brick, dense and dark with visible seeds. "This," she said, "has all its parts. Bran, germ, endosperm. It remembers what it is." Gael held it like something sacred. That evening, he made Clara a small dinner, her favorite soup, a lit candle, and a slice of that whole grain bread toasted, served with olive oil and rosemary. No grand apology, just presence, just choice. "I forgot," he said quietly, "but I remember now. I remember why it matters." Clara smiled and broke the bread with her hands. "You're not slipping," she said. "You're waking up." And for the first time in a long time, Gael believed her. By December, Gael had stopped thinking about bread in the way most people do. It was no longer a background habit. It wasn't just something to hold a sandwich or soak up soup. Bread had become, for him, a decision, a daily vote for clarity, for strength, for presence. He didn't talk about it much, not to neighbors, not even at family dinners, but the changes were visible. His son noticed it first. "You seem sharper, Dad," he'd said one Sunday afternoon while helping rake the yard. "And I don't just mean your memory, your eyes, you're more here." Gael had smiled, humbled. "I think I got quiet enough to hear what my body was saying," he replied. It had been months since he'd touched commercial loaves, the fluffy ones with soft crusts and labels that shouted health claims but whispered chemicals. In their place were dense sourdoughs, sprouted grain bricks, and whole grain breads that felt like food grown, not manufactured. He stored them in linen bags, sliced them carefully, and sometimes froze them in portions. It took work, but it felt like care. One morning in early January, Gael woke before sunrise. Clara was still asleep. The world was quiet. He brewed tea, lit a small candle on the kitchen table, and sat with his journal. Outside, frost traced patterns across the window. Inside, he traced a pattern of his own. Words, thoughts, shifts. "My legs feel lighter, my breath deeper, my mornings less fogged. I feel like I'm returning to myself, slice by slice." He remembered how strange that first switch had felt. The dense loaves, the chew, the sourness. It had challenged his tongue. But now the thought of soft white bread seemed foreign, like something from a past life. It wasn't just about the ingredients, it was about what they asked of him. The good bread made him slow down, chew, taste, digest with attention. It made him present. Clara came in a few minutes later, wrapping her sweater tighter. She kissed his cheek, poured herself tea. "Up early again?" she asked. He nodded. Felt like being still for a bit. She sat beside him, noticed the open notebook, and smiled. "You've been writing a lot lately." "I think the fog cleared," he said. And when it did, I realized how many days I'd been missing. She took a bite of toast, their now ritual sourdough, toasted with almond butter and sea salt. "You know," she said softly, "you're not just healthier, you're happier." He nodded, blinking against the soft light. "And not from a diet, just from finally choosing what feeds me." That day, they drove to visit Gail's sister, an old friend of Clara's, and their grandson Theo. On the way, they packed sandwiches made with homemade sprouted bread, sliced vegetables, and boiled eggs. Gail added a few dark chocolate squares in a wax paper pouch. At a red light, Clara looked over and said, "You know what's funny? I used to think this would all feel like restriction, but it feels more like restoration." He smiled. "Like getting something back you didn't know you'd lost." That evening, Theo crawled into Gail's lap with a picture book, and as they turned the pages together, Gail didn't feel stiff or tired or cloudy. He felt alive, focused, there. And as Clara sat nearby knitting, watching her husband's laughter fill the room, she whispered under her breath, "He's come back." It wasn't a miracle. It was a loaf of bread, with all its parts intact, made with time, eaten with presence. But for Gael, it was enough. Enough to turn back the fog, enough to make the world feel close again. And in the end, that single choice, to stop eating the bread that numbed him and start feeding the life he wanted to keep living, became the thread that stitched everything else back together. It's been nearly a year since Gael changed the bread on his table. And while some people might call that a small thing, Gael knows better now. He knows the body remembers what we forget. Every slice, every shortcut, every moment we say, "It's just food," while our energy fades and our memory slips. He lived in that forgetting for too long, but not anymore. Now, breakfast is slow and sacred. Clara still makes her tea. Gael still makes his toast. But the kitchen feels lighter somehow, more alive. The bread they share is dense, real, imperfect in shape, but perfect in meaning. Each bite is a quiet promise to stay awake to their choices, to care for each other not through grand gestures, but through small ones, through what's placed on the plate. Gael still has his days, the aches, the weather in his knees, the stubborn thoughts that sometimes drift off mid-sentence. But they come less often now. His thinking is clearer, his digestion steadier, and most importantly, his spirit no longer feels dulled by the weight of things he never questioned. Sometimes he speaks to friends who feel tired, foggy, older than their age. They tell him it's just part of getting older, and he nods kindly. But inside, he wants to say what he's learned, that aging isn't always the culprit, that sometimes the smallest decisions, what you put on your toast, what kind of loaf you reach for, can quietly shape your mind, your body, your future. He no longer craves softness in his bread. He craves substance, things that hold their shape, things that hold him. And in a world full of convenience, Gael has chosen something else. Conscious nourishment. Bread didn't save his life, but it brought him back to it. It started with one loaf. Gael didn't plan to share it. It wasn't a mission. It wasn't some grand idea to inspire others or be an example. He was simply hosting his daughter and her husband for lunch one rainy afternoon in February. Clara had made soup. Gael sliced the fresh whole grain sourdough with care, setting it beside the butter dish like he always did. No announcements, no speeches, but his daughter Ava took one bite, paused, and looked up. "Dad, where did you get this bread?" He smiled. "A little place across town. It's made the old way. No shortcuts." She nodded slowly. "It tastes grounding." And then she added, "I haven't felt that in a while." They didn't talk about it again that day, but the next week she texted him a photo of a loaf cooling on her own counter, baked from scratch with her son helping mix the dough. "You started something," she wrote. It happened again with his neighbor, Mrs. Leary, a widow who often dropped by with small gifts from her garden. One morning, Gael handed her a wrapped slice of sprouted bread with almond butter and a touch of sea salt. "Just try it," he said. She came back the next day, holding the empty napkin. "I slept through the night," she whispered, eyes wet. "That hasn't happened in weeks." Gael didn't claim credit. He never would. But he was learning something beautiful, that when you feed yourself with intention, others begin to feel it too. There's a peace that seeps into your presence, and people notice. One Sunday, at the small community center downtown, Gael offered to help with a nutrition talk for older adults. Nothing big, just stories, not science. He stood in front of a half-dozen other seniors and held up a dense loaf of bread like a sacred object. "This saved me from thinking my forgetfulness was just aging," he said. "Turns out I just needed to eat like I still mattered." There was silence and then slow nods. He shared what he'd learned, gently, humbly, not just about bread, but about slowing down, about reading labels, about the right to feel well even after 60, especially after 60. A right that had been quietly taken by convenience and given back by care. Gael went home that night tired but full. Clara met him at the door, arms around his shoulders. "You smell like toast," she teased. He laughed. "Better than smelling like hospital disinfectant," he said, and they both chuckled. In the quiet that followed, he whispered, "I never imagined something so small would lead me here." She leaned in. "It wasn't small, it was bread, and it brought you back." They sat together by the window, 2 slices resting on the plate between them, warm and golden from the oven. No guilt, no fear, just nourishment. And in that moment, with the rain tapping against the glass, the world outside felt uncertain. But inside, at the kitchen table, everything was whole. Her name was Maren, 63, divorced, recently diagnosed with early-stage type 2 diabetes. Gael met her at the community garden the second Sunday of March. She had joined late, unsure of what she needed, maybe just company, maybe air. She was pulling at the weeds like they'd wronged her personally, and Gael, watering his tomatoes, offered a gentle smile and a soft, "First year?" She sighed, nodding. "And I don't even like vegetables." That made him laugh. "Then you've come to the right place. Most of us start by pulling weeds we can't name." They began to talk. Small things at first. Weather, soil, the way knees creak louder in the spring. But eventually, Maren said what she'd been holding in. "I'm scared, not of the numbers, but of what it means, the guilt, the sudden rules. Everyone keeps saying, just eat better, like I haven't spent decades trying." Gael didn't offer advice, he just listened. And when the garden day ended, he walked to his car, opened the cooler in the back seat, and pulled out a wax-wrapped parcel. "Try this," he said, placing it in her hands. "Eat it slowly, no distractions, just you and the bread." She looked down. "Bread?" she said, half laughing. "They told me to stay far away from bread." Gael's voice was calm. "Not this kind. This one remembers where it came from, and it might help you remember where you are too." Maren texted him the next morning. "I cried while eating it, not because it was dramatic, but because it didn't punish me. It tasted like something from before the diagnosis, before the fear." Gael stared at the message for a long while. He thought of the days he had felt like that, like food had become the enemy, like every bite was a risk. But slowly, bite by bite, he had rewritten that story. And now, someone else was picking up the pen. He invited Maren for tea later that week. Clara made her favorite sourdough. Maren took small bites, eyes wide, face softening. She didn't ask for numbers, or recipes, or rules. She just said, "Why didn't anyone tell me food could feel like forgiveness?" Gael leaned back in his chair, because most of us are still healing from the shame we were fed. And shame has a long shelf life. They sat quietly for a while, the kind of silence only trust can hold. Maren looked at the loaf on the table, golden, dense, alive, and then at the couple across from her. "I think I want to learn how to make this," she said, "from scratch, start to finish." Clara smiled. "Then we'll show you." That weekend, the kitchen smelled like warmth and hope. Maren's hands were unsure but determined. Gael watched her knead the dough, elbows dusted in flour, cheeks flushed with effort. She laughed when it stuck, cursed when it collapsed. But when it rose, imperfect, lumpy, and real, she cried again, this time without shame. The bread wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And as it cooled on the rack, Gael handed her a small piece of parchment with a handwritten line. "You are not broken. You were just unrisen." She held the note to her chest. And in that quiet, dough-scented kitchen, surrounded by warmth, time, and second chances, Maren began to rise, spring again. The garden was waking up in shades of green and gold, and Gael stood at the edge of the raised beds, hands tucked behind his back, watching new shoots push through dark soil. A year had passed, a full year since the morning his toast had felt like a betrayal. A year since the fog, the forgetfulness, the quiet ache of thinking this must just be aging. Clara stepped up beside him, brushing earth from her palms. "They're coming along," she said, nodding toward the spinach. He smiled. "Everything's slower this year, but stronger." That was true of more than the spinach. Gael moved slower now, not out of stiffness, but because he had grown fond of stillness. He no longer rushed meals or ignored the whispers of his own body. He had learned to hear it, to trust it, to tend to it like a garden, not a machine. That afternoon, friends came over. A few neighbors. Maren, now blooming in her own way, brought a warm loaf she'd baked that morning, sprouted grain with rosemary and cracked black pepper. Her third batch this month. She placed it on the table beside Gail's sourdough, and the two loaves sat like old friends, imperfect, nourishing, whole. They broke bread together, sitting on the porch with cups of warm broth and stories that meandered like rivers. No one talked about diets, or blood sugar, or numbers on a scale. They talked about how certain foods made them feel present, about how something as simple as a sandwich could invite clarity or confusion, how healing wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was just eating toast and noticing your shoulders had dropped. As the sky deepened into dusk, Maren leaned over and asked Gael, "Do you ever miss the old bread?" He paused, thoughtful, then smiled. "No, but I miss who I used to be before I knew better. I was softer, more tired, but I didn't have to think." She nodded. "Now you think?" "Now I feel," he corrected. "And it's not always easier, but it's mine." Later that night, after the guests had gone, Gael stood in the kitchen wrapping leftover slices in linen. Clara came up behind him, rested her chin on his shoulder. "You know," she whispered, "you didn't just change the bread, you changed the rhythm of this whole house." He didn't reply. He just leaned into her warmth, hands stilling on the loaf, and let that truth settle. They didn't need anniversaries to mark this moment. The bread on the counter, the peace in their home, the clarity in their mornings, that was celebration enough. And as Gael turned off the lights and followed Clara to bed, he passed by the table once more, glancing at the two loaves side by side. He reached out and touched them gently, as if to say thank you, to the journey, to the choice, to the year that changed everything. Because in the end, it hadn't been about bread, it had been about becoming fully awake in your own life. One slice at a time. End of series. Would you like me to compile this full 10-part story into a YouTube narration script format, an ebook style PDF for download, or split it into short form posts or videos for social media? Let me know how you'd like to use this beautiful journey next. Gael's journey didn't begin with a diagnosis. It began with something smaller, so ordinary it was nearly invisible. A slice of toast, a quiet morning, a feeling that something just wasn't right. And from that moment of stillness, a question emerged. What if the food I trust is quietly hurting me? Over time, Gael didn't just change what was on his plate. He changed how he lived. He learned to listen to his body, his breath, his mind. He moved from fog to focus, from pain to presence. He let go of the soft, easy bread that had dulled his senses for years and chose loaves that were harder to chew but kinder to his health. Real bread, real change. And perhaps the most beautiful part? He didn't keep it to himself. His shift rippled into the lives around him, his wife, his daughter, his neighbor Maren. Not because he lectured, but because his clarity made others curious. And that's the quiet power of healing. It invites others in without ever needing to knock. So maybe today is a good day to pause, to open your cupboard, to read a label, to ask yourself, is this feeding me? Or is it simply familiar? You don't have to change everything overnight, but you can begin with one loaf, one label, one choice made in the name of your energy, your memory, your life. Because like Gael discovered, the smallest things, when chosen with care, can bring us back to ourselves. And sometimes all it takes is a slice of bread that remembers who you are.